I assumed that when I landed, that mandate was real, it was going to be supported. I found out very quickly that that assumption was naive. Here's what the customer's saying. And this is the friction that your internal organizational structure, your metrics and KPIs and incentive schemes are driving into your customers day to day. And remember, the customer's there for work. They're doing something to fulfill a piece of their job. Everything that we can do to take friction out of that helps them.
Welcome to the B2B Experience, brought to you by Big Light, one of Europe's leading experience design agencies. In this podcast series, we speak to digital pioneers in B2B and tell real stories of breaking down barriers and delivering change. I'm Steve Borges, and my guest today is Jonathan Newman, who began his digital journey way back in 1997 in his native Tasmania. Over a 25-year career, he's had senior leadership roles in major B2B organisations, always with a focus on digital innovation. Today, he's an advisor, a mentor, and a consultant, and works with businesses to empower them to deliver change. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me today. It's been quite a journey from Tasmania to Europe, and from the early days of B2B e-com in Ingram Micro. So it'd be great to hear a bit about that journey, really.
I've been asked about that journey a few times. I guess not a lot of Tasmanian expats get over this far and stay this long. I have to be honest, every time I field this question, I feel a little guilty because I'm here and it's down to a lot of luck and really not a lot of planning. I was fortunate that whilst I was studying at University of Tasmania, the last year they added an e-commerce major and I got into that. So, mid-90s e-commerce, coming out with that on a degree certificate was pretty lucky. And after traveling for a bunch of time, I ended up in the UK with no money and a work visa. So thought better get myself a job, and really lucked in. I got a project management job with Ingram Micro in e-commerce. So to think that a year before I was living the life of a student in Hobart to working for a global corporation in an e-commerce project management role right at the beginning of this e-commerce explosion.
Fantastic. Good job you didn't do marine biology or something like that, isn't it?
I'm very fortunate. I spent a lot of time at Ingram. I like to think professionally I grew up there. I was there for 12 years and learned a lot. Ingram's a company that, because of the role they play in the supply chain, huge focus on optimization and efficiency. And if you're a technologist trying to bring change and efficiency into an organization and the organization's just focused on that, opens up some really interesting doors. So that was a lot of fun. It led to a number of interesting opportunities. You touched on Office Depot, joined the European board there at the start of a transformational journey. I've also spent time at Belkin, Future Electronics, at Belron. And then most recently, I spent some time in B2B SaaS sales. I was running a company selling e-commerce search technology. And now, as you said, I'm working as an advisor and doing some what I describe as fractional digital transformation leadership. Being fractional is cool these days.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yes. Do you have a specific approach that you use when you go into a new organization now that you would take to start the process of digital innovation?
There's a few things that have just become a habit or a routine when I'm taking on a new challenge. First, I'm trying to immerse myself in the business. Spend as much time as I can over those first few weeks talking not just to the leaders, but to all the various stakeholders across the organization, even getting in and spending lots of time with those on the front line, understanding how they're solving customer problems, the friction they've got, what makes the company different. Try and get as much of that down on paper as I possibly can. And then just lock myself in a room and try and synthesize as much knowledge of the business as I possibly can. You can come in and look at it and say, okay, well, what's digital best practice? What's the customer trying to do? What type of approaches will improve or enhance the customer journey? So you still got a fresh view, but try and also get as much depth of understanding of how that business ticks and what makes it unique. The second thing I always do is then try and walk the customer journey from start to finish. It's amazing what you uncover. amazing the friction that the business is artificially inserting into that process, friction that you can very easily eliminate, improve customer satisfaction, and ultimately improve conversion and stickiness. One of the little tricks I love around that is getting staff to use the same tools to purchase. Most of the organizations I've been with, staff purchasing has been an employee benefit, but often it's sort of a paper form that you email around or you carry around to go and take advantage of that benefit. As quickly as possible, move that online and get all of the staff in every functional area using your e-commerce experience and go through the same journey that your customers are going through or suffering through to take advantage of that benefit. That really helps focus the minds and get people thinking about what could be done differently.
That's a really practical and powerful way of doing it. So thinking about going into a new organization, what's the best approach that you've found to convince the organization to act?
Let me turn that around to what I think is the most ineffective. I was hired into a role where in the interviews, the president was telling me about, the replatforming that he wanted me to do, the organization that he wanted me to build, all of these investments. I'm going through the recruitment process. I'm like, fantastic. I've got a strong mandate here. And I assumed that when I landed, that mandate was real. It was going to be supported. Found out very quickly that that assumption was a bit naive. I pitched the first proposal to the board, and he shot me down unmercifully. And it was all about lack of confidence in the organization's ability to deliver. But what he wanted me to do, which I hadn't understood, was he wanted me to explain how we were going to be successful and how the history that I wasn't aware of and I wasn't part of was going to be overcome. So that assumption that because I'd been hired, because they'd said that they had the need to change, because I was told the budget was there, because I felt that that mandate was clear, I had to step back several steps in the process to really earn the right to be able to pull the trigger. Now, in hindsight, it should have been obvious to me, but it was quite a disconcerting mistake to make.
So how did you adapt that approach to walk into a subsequent organization and be really effective at getting the organization to change?
Yeah, so there's a few lessons I learned from that I've applied multiple times since. First and foremost, I try and build a coalition of sponsorship across my peer group. As the digital leader coming in to drive change can be very isolating. But if the head of sales or the head of customer service is making the argument for you, then suddenly the whole board's listening, because it's seen much more as a organizational initiative rather than some smart aleck who's trying to say, here's how to run the business. That coalition of support's really, really critical. Second thing I do is I go back to my synthesis of what's happened in the organization historically, and I look for all those landmines. So if the organization has a history of failing to deliver technology projects, I've got to overcome that. How am I overcoming that? What's my risk mitigation strategy? How am I going to deliver change without causing some sort of operational impact? And then the third thing I always do is actually make the whole conversation about the customer journey. In B2B, you see a lot of focus on operational performance, efficiency. They do several things and they do them brilliantly. That's not always what the customer sees. The customer will quite often see something different. And the other great thing for creating an impetus for change is really saying, here's what the customer's seeing. And this is the friction that your internal organizational structure and your metrics and KPIs and incentive schemes are driving into your customers day to day. It's a great way of getting alignment, great way of breaking down functional silos, and a great way of building support and sponsorship from the board.
I've heard several times before that by exposing the reality of the customer experience within the organization then feels compelled to act. Is understanding the existing customer experience enough to overcome the resistance to change within the organization? Is there more required to unblock or overcome resistance?
Those are key, right? So shining that spotlight on what the customer experience is today and articulating a vision as to what it could be tomorrow. Those things generally excite people. People are aware of what the consumer experience is in the B2C world. Being able to articulate how you can learn from that and build that in a B2B organization, very, very powerful. The other one that's not to be underestimated is the complexity of managing change. But when it comes to change that can have an impact on operational performance, that's where the board gets very, very sensitive. We've all seen and heard horror stories about major technology projects that have completely taken an organization out for weeks or months. So trying to come up with a risk mitigation strategy that works for the organization and builds that confidence is pretty key.
We've talked a bit about resistance. I'm just intrigued to ask whether you come across a level of resistance that surprised you, and then how did you overcome that resistance?
So one of the early lessons that springs to mind on that was how to engage the exec team to drive sponsorship and adoption of the tools that we were deploying. And I remember a situation where the regional VPs were saying the right things, but it was largely lip service. And then within the business units they controlled, there was very little pressure being applied on people to change their ways of working. My first approach to trying to address that was to increase the communication of our metrics, assuming that by showing the benefit in terms of the impact on the operational KPIs, these execs and their management teams would instantly be motivated to consume that information and want to drive improvement. Now, I made that barrier too high. I sent them a lot of operational KPIs and presented it as typical management KPI reports. Very, very hard to get engaged with and excited about, especially as their new metric. Had the other problem that they were lagging indicators. It's not really coming in a way that helps drive behavior. I felt that the answer was still in the data, so I made the data far more accessible. A combination of, yes, some lagging indicators saying what had happened, but also started introducing leading indicators. That became really interesting for them to understand how some of the early stages of the customer experience were going to impact outcome next week, next month, and then made it a little bit of fun. And I made it fun by telling stories. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it, trying to bring it to life in that sense, but also made it fun by creating some competition. And, at the time I was running e-commerce across 13 countries. So we put together a league table on every one of the metrics that we were really focused on and forced ranked the countries based on performance. Very quickly, this changed the dynamic. Suddenly leading indicators were available so people could start using it as a steering tool, as a planning tool. And we created this competition between the e-commerce leads and the business unit owners so they could see how they were performing relative to their peer group. No one wanted to be bottom. Everybody wanted to be the top of that table. Within a matter of months, they were at the point that they were owning the performance of the countries within their region and creating and building on that competitive dynamic, changing the way I communicated with them and giving them something that was actionable, allowed them to embrace it and to own the transformation we were going through. And it was incredible. The acceleration that their sponsorship drove was exactly what we're looking for.
That's a nice quote. I'll be using that one. It's quite similar to what you were saying about customer needs, isn't it? It's treating those internal stakeholders as customers, and tailoring what you do to influence them based on their needs, rather than trying to compel them in some way or trying to influence them in sort of more traditional ways.
That's a really astute point. You think about B2B organizations, those that are going through transformation have been around for a long time. B2B organizations that have inherently been around for a long time are very, very good at what they do. So if you're going to go in, you've got to understand that organization has built-in defense mechanisms. They'll have functions that are optimized around very specific tasks and do them brilliantly. But when you've got to break some of that down and rebuild that organization will very quickly give you all the objections to the change you're trying to put in. Bringing that back and anchoring it on the customer is critical. I'll go a step further. It's critical that as a leader in a B2B organization trying to drive change, you understand that, and this is going to sound really obvious, the customer's doing a job. They're not there for pleasure. They're there for a professional purpose. Do you fully understand what that job is? What is their job to be done? What would make that more efficient for them? What's the friction in that journey? I remember, at Office Depot, one of the things we came to realize very, very quickly is a lot of the people purchasing from us were not experts in the products that they were purchasing. If you're an office manager or a secretary or a receptionist and you're having to buy toner cartridges for the whole office, and these toner cartridges are 300, 400 euros each, then you want to be sure you're buying the right one. But that's pretty confusing and pretty complicated. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we build confidence around that purchasing decision? If you can really develop that empathy, you can reimagine what that customer journey should look like. You can reimagine the way the functions need to be combined to support that customer journey, and you can do some pretty incredible things. But you've got to remember that if the organization hasn't typically thought that way, trying to get them to think that way is going to trigger an immune response.
Two things that spring to mind related to that point. One that I haven't heard for a long time, but I heard at the conference we both went to a couple of months ago. And that is, if I ask my customers what they want, they'll ask for a faster horse. And the other is that there is a danger when you try and assess existing experiences. Your customers have learned the experience. And actually, there's a resistance to change within the customer base because they perceive that if you start messing around with these platforms, I'm going to have to relearn it. I'm just interested in your perspective on those 2 points.
So start with the last one, change management of the customer and that they're familiar with the tools that you've provided previously. You cannot underestimate the complexity of successfully managing the change. And I'll be honest, there are many times where we've delivered customer experiences that are suboptimal because we've tried to create a compromise between what user experience design tells us is optimal and what we've already got, and to try and break that transition from the as is to the to be into multiple steps. So yeah, can't underestimate the fact that this is a business tool that your customers are dependent on. And if you break their process, they're going to be really upset. And that's where you start to see them abandoning that channel, or worse, abandoning you overall.
And our friend, the faster horse.
Yeah, the faster horse. My view is that you have to ask the customer what the problem is they're solving. The framework that I use and like is this concept of the job to be done, and trying to understand the real reason that somebody's making a purchase or completing this workflow or that workflow. The real world example of this is the persistence of fax as an ordering channel in a lot of the European B2B markets. And I've been in so many organizations where at the top they go, just turn the fax machines off. This is ridiculous. But it's not until you understand the reason that you can actually start to come up with a solution that solves that problem in a different, more efficient, more digital way. The fax is used by organizations that have very low delegation of authority. And somebody has to physically sign a purchase order before it can be sent. You get the fax coming over, it's the purchase order, all very straightforward. And there's a scribble on the bottom where whoever's got the sign-off authority has sent that through. If you don't solve that problem, you can't digitize that journey for those customers. So looking at why is this happening and truly getting to the job to be done, the problem that's being solved, that's where you start to unlock change.
We've talked a lot about resistance to change and the importance of building coalitions and bringing people with you. We haven't talked about technology. Actually, no, that's not true. The only technology we've talked about is fax machines. So that's something, doesn't it? But I was interested as well. The event that I mentioned that we went to a few months ago, the hall was full of vendors of technology, and yet pretty much every conversation was about people. It was about customers. It was about data challenges. What's your perspective on the importance of people versus technology?
Technology is an enabler. It's an enabler and nothing more. There will be a better technology tomorrow. There'll be a better technology a year from now. It will continue to evolve. The best technology will be completely derailed by a group of people that have misaligned objectives or are not bought into how to leverage that technology. I genuinely believe that people get up in the morning and they go to work to win. So then how do you set about enabling them to win? And how do you make sure that that definition of winning is aligned to the overall company goal? Making sure that those goals and those objectives are appropriately aligned to create exceptional experiences, not set in a way that manifests as friction for the customer themselves.
Thank you. So looking back, what's one thing that you would do differently or that you wish you'd known earlier?
I guess the most important lesson that's embarrassing to admit that it took me a while to learn it, but digital transformation is a team sport. It's not something that you can drive as an individual. And the times that I've seen setbacks or delays, encountered resistance, when I diagnose it, it's all been, I've not brought the right people with me. When I've been able to do the reverse, when I've been able to get my peer group aligned and championing for the change, when I've got the board sponsoring this and driving for adoption, when I've created the empowered teams, that have a clear goal, when you get that perfect storm, what any organization can do is incredible.
That's so true.
I think in terms of lessons learned, there's probably a second one that's worth talking about. You've got to remember that this organization that you've just joined and that you're trying to transform has been successful up to this point. And that success was driven by something. And if you don't have the humility to accept that, and you don't have the curiosity to go and find those things, you will quickly fail. One example that, again, during my time at Office Depot was some problems we had around search and product discovery on the e-commerce website. We put in some good technology. Our data was pretty clean. We had some good search engineers tuning the algorithm. Mathematically, it was looking pretty good, but it was still not as good as it needed to be. We were looking at this as a search problem and really struggling to find what was missing. It wasn't until my marketing ops team turned up with a box of print catalogs that I realized what was going on. I grabbed one of the books and I opened it up on a page of pens. In a 3-inch by 3-inch ad on a piece of paper, I was able to see at a glance every color variant and every packaging variant of that pen with the price. If I went to the website to try and find that, it was very difficult to get to that same answer. And that was a bit of an epiphany. At that point, we really embraced the team behind those ad placements in the catalog because they'd spent 30 years optimizing that. So having that humility and that curiosity, be humble enough to know that the organization has been incredibly successful. It does things brilliantly. Be then curious enough to go find them and to figure out how to transform them from analog to digital, how to create that same solution for the customer, but deliver it in a different experience.
So looking back, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to a younger, someone like a younger Jonathan trying to deliver change in a B2B organization?
Certainly. So if I look back, the thing that I would tell a younger version of me to prioritize, perhaps more than I did at the time, is to go into an organization and look around at the existing digital assets. It could be a search engine that's 10 years old. It could be a piece of marketing automation software. It could be the checkout process. But find something that's underperforming, and without a major replacement of that technology, apply best practices and get the improvement. The CFO will love it because you're not asking for a huge amount of money. The organization as a whole will love it because you start to have a meaningful impact against the results. And it will be the most powerful and helpful thing you do to start driving organizational change. Inherently, to make one of these underutilized assets work to its best potential, you have to start the organization thinking cross-functionally. You have to start the organization thinking outside in. What's the customer experience look like? How is this asset enabling that customer experience? And the time you spend on starting that organizational journey will pay dividends tenfold as you get into the real heavy lift transformation work that you'll probably be taking on next. You win credibility with the board, you win credibility with the CFO, you start to deliver an immediate result, and selfishly, you start the organizational transition that will set you up for success in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. That's I've picked out a few highlights from our conversation. I think it's interesting that when you land, You can't necessarily assume that because you're there, you have a mandate to make change happen. That the most important thing to do, apart from understanding the complexity of the business, is to walk the customer journey. But to make something happen, you need to build a coalition of the willing. The job to be done framework, that's very interesting. Rather than thinking about the solution, think about what the customer is trying to achieve by applying the solution. I can see it's so easy to go into an organization and think, because we're coming at it from a digital point of view, to forget why the business has been successful in the first place, and to learn from that and build on that, particularly the example of the print catalogue and the fax. I haven't had a conversation about those things for a while, and perhaps there's a sense of arrogance if you're not careful that we've come in and we have all the answers because digital is the way forward. Thanks for that. So just to wrap up, I've got a question to finish with. It's called B2B buzzword bingo. So what's one buzzword that's overused or a trend that's overhyped in B2B digital right now that you wish would disappear, and why?
And there's a lot to choose from. I hate the term consumerization, and yet the trends behind consumerization of B2B, I fundamentally believe are correct. I think we need to think about it differently, because we're not ever going to have our B2B personas thinking like consumers. But we have to remember that they're there to do a job. So when I think about personalization in B2B, I always think about it as three dimensions. I think about the firmographics, information about the business itself. That's fundamental. And in the consumer world, you don't have to think about that at all. You've got to understand the role of the person you're dealing with. So that roles-based element is critical. And it's not just personalization as to which ad you show them, it's which functional experiences they get. Somebody in finance is coming in to retrieve invoices, has a very important job to be done. You want to satisfy that, but it's nothing to do with the shopping experience. And then the last thing is about the person themselves. How am I engaging with them? What type of emotional response are they? That's the most consumerized piece of it, but it's also the third pillar. And if you don't get those first two right, then anything you do around demographics is going to be pointless. Your personalization is not going to be successful. So the underlying trend in this transition of providing a better experience fundamentally believes right. But consumerization of B2B has become a bit of a buzzword, and I think it sets the wrong expectations.
But I promise never to use it again. I think you're quite right. And I'm actually quite impressed that we've managed to talk for all this time and we haven't even talked about AI. Isn't that good? Jonathan, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. We've covered a lot. I've learned a lot. It's an interesting story, and I'm pleased that we get the chance to share it, actually.
Steve, thank you for inviting me along. It's been a pleasure, and it's quite the privilege, quite the honor to be part of this series as you're starting it up. I look forward to listening to the rest.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve.
Well, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, then please don't forget to hit subscribe on your platform of choice. And if you'd like to find out more about how Big Light helps its clients discover the needs of their customers and deliver experiences that meet them, then check out our website or follow us on LinkedIn. I'll see you next time.